We're on Daf Chesamid Beis, and we're up to Omar Le. Omar Le Rabbi Barchama, 3 lines down from the top of the Omar, the Rav. And the question is, how do we know that Oleha, the Pasuk Oleha, is coming to exclude only the Isur Tzara? Ema, couldn't we suggest, this is the question of Rabbi Barchama, that Oleha is coming to exclude Erva Gufe, the Erva herself, meaning that the Torah is teaching us that in the case of Achos Isha, the Torah did not permit Achos Isha unless it's a mitzvah of Yibum, but Shalom b'malkum mitzvah Tishteret. And just to remind you of our discussion of last week, that you can have Achos Isha Shalom b'malkum mitzvah. And that means that a man married a woman, and now he wants to marry her sister. And let's say, for example, it was Shalom b'malkum mitzvah, and the Torah would not permit a man to marry Achos Isha. So that now, instead of using the word Oleh as a mute to tell me that there's no Yibum and to exclude the case of Itzara, maybe the Torah is telling me that there's no Achos Isha in the case of Shalom b'malkum mitzvah. And therefore the Torah would be Matir Achos Isha. So it's coming to teach me Shlo Asra Torah Achos Isha Ella b'makom mitzvahs Yibum. Now, this is a very paradoxical proposition offered by Rabbi Barchama. Oh, you mean the code?
Just
you need a code. To unlock it for others, you mean?
Yeah.
There's a little shuchkik. See if you can move it from one side to the other. See if you find it. It's very, very small. So the Gemara is suggesting now that in a case of b'makom yibum, the mitzvah of yibum, the Torah prohibits achos ishta. But shalom b'makom mitzvah, the Torah is going to be matir achos ishta. The Torah never prohibited marrying 2 sisters. So Rava says, v'lav kal v'chomri, that's a very strange, logical present preposition. If b'makom mitzvah asira, if when there's a mitzvah of Yibum, the Torah says you can't marry the wife, the sister of your wife, then shalom b'makom mitzvah sharia, the Torah is going to be matir and erva. Why? There's no mitzvah. Amalei. So Rabbi Barchama wants to reject the kal v'chomer of Rava, and he says the following: it's possible that there's an element here of gzeras hakosu, that the Torah wants to be machmir in achos isha dafka in the case of makom mitzvah. And I'll prove it to you. Sarah tochiach, the makom mitzvah asira, shalom makom mitzvah sharia. In the case of a tzara, a man is allowed to marry a tzara of an erva. I mean, she's an erva, but her tzara is not an erva. He's allowed to marry a tzara. But dafka in the case of yibum, he's not allowed to marry a tzara's erva. You see, the Torah is more machmir with regard to arayos in the case of Yibum than it does in the case of Shalom b'makom mitzvah. Amalei, so Rava says, Olech hamakra, in order to undermine your logic, the Torah says, and I'll read the whole pasuk, with regard to Achos Isha, it says, Legalos ervasa oleh b'chayena. So see, we're on the top of Daf Chesamid Beis, about 10 lines down, a little bit less. B'chayena, what does the Torah mean when it adds the word b'chayeha? Kol she b'chayeha, in other words, achos isha, as long as his wife, which is the sister of the woman that he wants to marry, is alive, then she's prohibited. And it doesn't matter whether it's b'makom mitzvah, shalom b'makom mitzvah. So the Gemara says, yeah, you want to use the word b'chayeha to teach you that it matters not whether it's b'makom mitzvah, shalom b'makom mitzvah, meaning Rava accepts the logic of Rabbi Barchama and the possibility that Shalom b'makom mitzvah Achos Isha would be Muteres, but the Torah wrote Bechayah to teach you that Bein b'makom mitzvah, Bein shalom b'makom mitzvah, she's Asura. So Gemara asks, wait a minute. Hi, that pasuk Bechayah mi boile, I needed Lema'ute liachar misa. Bechayah has to be understood kipshuto, that you cannot marry Leah when you're married to Rachel because Rachel's alive. But if Rachel, your wife, dies, then you can marry Leah. And this we know from the word Bechayah. So the Gemara says, that's no question. He, the heter of Achos Isha, liachar misa, is not derived from Bechayah. The fact that you're allowed to marry Leah after the death of Rachel, your wife, is derived from a different pasuk. And that is the Isha el Achosa, it says Lo Sikach, Nafka, and that's going to be the source, that the Isha is only when Lo Sikach, when Lokha, when he takes her together with her sister. In other words, Isha el Achosa Lo Sikach, meaning the Lo Sikach should not be Isha and Achosa, when they're both alive and well. You can't be married to two sisters simultaneously. That's derived from Lo Sikach. Therefore, I don't need the word B'chayah to limit the Isur of Achos Ishto to as long as your wife is alive. That I can derive from Lo Sikach. And I'm going to use B'chayah to determine that there's no difference between the Isur Achos Ishto b'makom mitzvah of Yibum or Shalom b'makom mitzvah. The Gemara is still not happy. I need the pasuk B'chayah for a different drush. I meiva isha el achosa. If you're going to tell me that the pasuk Lo Sikach, Isha el achosa Lo Sikach, is going to be the source that allows you to marry Leah after the death of your wife Rachel, I would have thought that Nizgarsha Shara. The Torah says Lo Sikach means you shouldn't be married to two sisters. But if you divorced one of them, let's say you divorced your wife Rachel, then you're permitted to marry Leah. That would have been our Havami. Why? Because it's no longer considered Isha Lachosa Lo Sikach, meaning taking both a woman and her sister. You divorced your wife. Talmud Lomar, B'chayeha, Kol B'chayeha is Asur, meaning as long as your wife Rachel is alive, she's no longer your wife, you divorced her, you're not allowed to marry Leah, her sister. And that we derive from the word B'chayeha. B'chayeha means Kol Zman She'chayeh. Wherever she is, she's married to someone else, it doesn't matter, you can't marry Leah. It's a very interesting concept when you think about it. That if your wife Chas v'shalom dies, then you can marry her sister. But if your wife was divorced, you can't marry her sister. Even though if you married a sister, you would not be married to two sisters at the same time. But the Torah says B'chayeh, Kol B'chayeh. The Afagav Nizgarsha Lo Sikach es Achos. So therefore, the pasuk B'chayeh is not superfluous, and therefore we come back to our question: how do we know that there's an Iser Erev of Achos Ishto, even Shalom b'makom mitzvah? Again, the even is very problematic, but given the fact that we saw such a thing in Tzara, that Tzaras Ereva is only Asura b'makom Yibum, so in a funny sort of sense, the mitzvah Yibum is an Oseres, not a Materes, but an Oseres. Hello, Omer Avhuna bar Tachlifa, which made the Rava. How do we know that the Torah prohibits Achos Ishto even? Shalom b'makom mitzvah, trei kroi ksive. We're going to take into conjunction two psukim. Ksiv. One pasuk says, Isha el achos solo sikach litzra. And we're going to emphasize the word litzra. Litzra means that they will become tsaros. It means they're both asuros. Whether it's she or it's her tsara. Uksir, but then the pasuk says legalos ervasa. Ervasa is b'lashon yachid. So litzar refers to both of them together because that's what litzar means, that they're both tsaros. But the word ervasa indicates one woman. The Chadomash Mahakesim. How do we reconcile these two psukim that contradict each other? And the answer is that litzrar is b'makom mitzvah de'en asuros. That it means that whether it's the erva or the tsaras erva, they are both asuros. And now we understand the meaning of the word litzrar when you want to marry both of them. Shalom b'makom mitzvah, hi asura, v'tzarasa muteres. But the tzara is muteres. So it comes out that the erva is asura, afilu shalom b'makom mitzvah, because if not, we would have no reconciliation of this stira in the psuki. So the Gemara is not happy with that. I could really reconcile this contradiction between the two psukim in the exact opposite manner. I'm going to interpret it as follows. The makom mitzvah, that's where it says legalos ervasa, iasura tzurasa, muteres, the lashon yachid of ervasa is coming to exclude the tzara, and now we're going to come to the conclusion that the erva is asura, but the tzara is muteres. And the word litzrar, which indicates both of them, is shalom b'makom mitzvah. And shtei and asura. So in that case, whether it's the erva or it's the tzara, if it's shalom b'makom mitzvah, they're both asuros. So imagine if a man is married to two wives, and one of them is an erva to, let's say, right, Reuven's married to two wives. One of those two wives is an erva to Shimon. The other of that wife is just the tzara of an erva. And if Shimon wants to marry the tzara of an erva, then the Torah is saying that shalom b'makom mitzvah shtei and asuros. Not only is the erva asura, that we know, but even the tzaras erva. You have Reuven and Shimon. Shimon's not allowed to marry the tzara of his erva, who was married to some other man, and that man is out of the picture as far as that tzaras erva is concerned. And now we're saying that Shimon can't marry the tzara of an erva. So we really are in trouble now. We don't know how to reconcile this stira in the psukim between, on the one hand, litzar, and the other hand, erva sa. Litzar implies two, erva sa one. Where it says, in Cain, if you're going to use the epoch, and you're going to tell me that litzar is shalom b'makom mitzvahs yibum, and it's coming to tell me that, again, litzar is always two, that shtei and asuros, is then lo yomar aleha. Also could have omitted the word aleha, and that would have been fine. Now here, the Masechet gives a very fine overview of Rashi. So I'll just read the Masechet. Yein lomar shenichtav kidei lelamed alegalos ervasa shudafka b'makom mitzvah. And we're not going to interpret that when it says legalos ervasa, it's b'makom mitzvah and shalom b'makom mitzvah. They're both asuros. Shari adover muva mielo ki me'acher v'lefanenu shnei ksuva machishin zetzeh halitzor oser afas hatzara halegalos ervasa eno oser ela es ha'erva levad umatir es tzarasa yoser mistaber lahamid es hakosu ha'oser shalom b'makom mitzvah. It makes more sense intuitively to assume that the pasuk that's coming lesser, meaning litzar, is shalom b'makom mitzvah. Pasuk matir erva sa in the singular. The makom mitzvah, the Torah in the makom mitzvah was more lenient. The ein tzarech, we don't need yitar oleh. We don't need the extra pasuk oleh. That's what the Gemara says in Cain lo yomar oleh. It has to go the other way around. Sholeh nemar ala litzor, ubola hotzif misvar pshuta, ulahachmir b'makom mitzvah yosem asher shalom b'makom mitzvah. So the aleh is going on litzor, and it is telling me bola hotzi. Now, you have to emphasize the word lahotzi here. I'm sorry. Ubola hotzi me'asvara pshita, and it's a kind of counterintuitive preposition that we derive from the word oleha. That b'makom mitzvah we have to be machmir, and more so than shalom b'makom mitzvah. Lahachmir b'makom mitzvah yoser me'asher shalom b'makom mitzvah. Okay. Now, at this point, again, I never know. You'll tell me which pages you have from the Yalkut HaBiurim. But we were looking at page Samach, and now we're looking at page Samach Al. Page? No, we don't have? Okay. Now, you may recall, or let's refresh our memories, that with regard to whole the Ishtrei, the Gemara wanted to establish that the first Isur had a matir to it, and then subsequently there was a second Isur. The matir from the first Isur could be chal on the second Isur, correct? But if, let's say, the second Isur would come first, then we're not going to say whole Ishtrei in order to set up a kind of retroactive and use the heter of that comes subsequently to the first Isur. So again, Kadama Isur Hasheni ain't Omrim Hod. We're not going to say Hod. So therefore the Gemara says the following: Nasa mes, velo mes, v'achkach nasa chai, lo eschazi le klal. Right, let's take a look again at the Lachon B'Shas. It's always good to review this. We're on Daf Ches, Omid Aleph. Why is it not here? Okay. Oh, I'm looking on the wrong side. So it's mamish the first line on Daf Ches Omid Aleph, right? Tenach heicha de nosa mes, v'akach nosa chai. So the brother that unfortunately died, he was the one who married first, and then nosa chai, the Yavam, married subsequently. So already at the moment that, let's call him Shimon, married, second, right? At the moment that Shimon married, what names do we want to give her? Let's call it Rachel. Okay, we'll call her Rachel, who is the sister of Reuven's wife, Leah. Reuven had already at that time married Leah, so that Shimon's marriage to Rachel was subsequent to Reuven's marriage to Leah. So Reuven dies, and there was a matir of Yibum regarding Eshes Ach. So now, when Shimon marries Rachel, we're going to apply the principle of whole v'ishtray. Since there already was a heter that was chal vis-a-vis Eshes Ach, therefore there'll be a heter that could be chal vis-a-vis Achos Ishta. Okay. Now we get to Rabbi Khan, which you'll see on the second law. He says, Masha ein omrim hoil ve'ishrei elam kain kadam hetero shel rishon le iser shel sheni lefarish shehu mishum shesvaras hoil v'ishrei mo'ilo rak limnoa es ha'isur milachu. In other words, you needed the heter of the Rishon, meaning the heter of Eishes Ach, to prevent the erva of Achos Isha from being Chal through the mechanism of whole Vishrei Ish. Avali Achar Shekvar Chal, once the Iser erva of Achos Ishta's Chal, let's say in the case where Shimon married Rachel before Reuven married Leah, Ein B'Kol Chal Afkia, even though later on there's going to be a heter with regard to the erva of Eishes Achiv, but there cannot be a heter. We can't expand that heter to include Achos Ishto, because we cannot prevent the Chalotz Isser of Achos Ishto. Why? Because the moment that Reuven marries Leah, at that moment already Shimon is enjoined from having a relationship with Leah, because she's Achos Ishto, he's married to Rachel, he married first. Now let me just think for a second. If, on the other hand, Reuven married first, see, if Reuven married Leah first, then at the moment that Shimon marries Rachel, we can already build in a heter to that erva. If Reuven will die without children, because because when Reuven marries Leah, so there's already a heter on the erev of Leah vis-a-vis Shimon in event that Reuven dies without children. And that heter is necessary for the Easter erev of Eishes Ach. Once we activate the heter of Easter Eishes Ach, then we extend it to include Achos Ishto, so that now when Shimon gets around to marrying Rachel, at that point, already built into the erev relationship vis-a-vis Leah, between Shimon and Leah, we already have a heter. Why? Because we could already apply a whole Vishrei Ishtri. So the moment from the get-go, says Rabbi Khan, the moment that Shimon marries Rachel, there's already a heter for Shimon to marry Leah. So if that be the case, and even though Leah is the sister of Shimon's wife Rachel, but there already was a heter as far as the erva vis-a-vis Leah, the moment that that Shimon married Rachel, and that generated, right, that kicks off, so to speak, an erva to Leah, because Leah is the wife of his sister. But from the moment that Reuven married Leah, there already was then fixed in place a heter on the erva of Achos Ishto as a result of the heter on Eishes Achar. So if you ask me, what's the situation when Shimon marries Rachel? What's his relationship, so to speak, to Leah, the wife of his brother Reuven? And the answer is it's a very complicated relationship. Obviously, she's a Chos Ishta. She's also a Shizach. However, since the potential of Yibum is built into the marriage of Reuven with Leah, so on the tzad that Reuven will die childless, etc., Leah is muteres to Shimon in event of Yibum. So that's one interpretation of Rebbe Chum. Now he gives a second interpretation. The Odyesh Lefare, she'im adayin lo hutar ha'isur ha'rishon b'zman shechal ha'sheni, lama lanu lomar hoil v'yesh lahatir ha'rishon mitar gamis ha'sheni. I don't know what he means by Hutar Ha'itza. I think he means the death of Reuven. Maybe that's what he means. She'im adayin lo Hutar Ha'isa Rishon bizman shechal ha'sheni lama lanu lomar hoil v'yesh lahatir ha'rishon natir es ha'sheni halo adra v'yesh lomar ha'hefech hol v'roya dover liyoser machmas ha'isa ha'sheni yesh li osra gam v'isa rishon lo latiro. V'nafkemina ben shnei pirushim b'mokom shechalu shnei ha'isur b'vas achas. Shalatam arishon yesh lomar bazeh hol v'ishrei ishrei kidei limnoa es ha'isra sheni milahaschil lochu. Avolatam ha'sheni ein lomar hol v'ishrei ela adra v'yesh lesar af machmas ha'isra rishon v'lo latiro hol v'nesar machmas ha'sheni. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to look at the nafkamina, which I'll read to you, and then maybe we'll work backwards. He says, "B'makom shechalu shnei ha'isurim b'vas achas." I'm not sure what he means. Does he mean that Reuven and Shimon both married sisters at the same time? I don't know. Shalatama rishon yesh lomer bazeh hol v'ishrei k'dei l'noa es ha'isra ha'sheni milahaschil lochu. Avalatama sheni ein lomer hol v'ishrei ela adra yesh lesar ach machmas ha'isra rishon Below latiro hol v'nesar machmas Hashem. So at least we know where we have to get to. You know, the goal line is a case where chalu shnei ha'isurim b'vasachas. Right? We'll underline that. So that's where we have to get to. Shechalu shnei ha'isurim b'vasachas. So what does that mean? Chalu shnei ha'isurim b'vasachas. Well, let's go over the two tzaddim. It says the following. According to the first side, the svar of hoil is to prevent an iser from being chal. Once the iser is chal, then hoil does not have the power to be mafkia an iser. So therefore, if Shimon married Rachel, he's not allowed to marry Leah. Once that iser is chal, there's no room for whole v'ishrei ishrei. This whole v'ishrei ishrei can only be meaningful to prevent an iser from being chal, and to establish that at the very moment that Shimon married Rachel, there was already a heter for Shimon to be married to Leah. How so? Because Reuven married Leah before Shimon married Rachel. That I understand. So far, we're on solid ground. We cannot apply whole v'ishrei if the iser was already chal. If you have one moment in which the iser is unfettered, so to speak, and that's the moment that Shimon married Rachel, and his iser vis-a-vis Leah is set in stone at this point, you can't blow up, you can't undermine that stone later on when there's a heter chal vis-a-vis Leah, meaning when Reuven then marries Leah and dies, and Leah falls for you. Because Leah is already categorized in the status of Achos Ishto from the moment that Shimon married Rachel. I'm sorry, that Shimon married Leah. I may have gotten the names mixed up, but you know what I mean. Leah is the wife of Reuven, and Rachel is the wife of Shimon. So that I understand. Now, Rabbi Chanan seems to want to take a different approach. I'll read it again. This is the third time I'm reading it because the language is very, very heavy. He says, Od yesh lefar she'im adayin lo hutar ha'isur harishon bizman shechal hasheni. Which again, I think he's talking about a scenario where Shimon married Rachel before Reuven married Leah. That's what I thought he meant. Is lama lama lomar hoil v'yesh lahatir so rishon natir es hasheni lama lama lomar alo adra v'yesh lama lomar hefer hol v'roya doverli oser achmas ha'isa hasheni yesh lo so af b'isa rishon lo latiro. So what I think he's saying is that there's a svara afucha here. In a case where Shimon married Rachel first, you've already established an Isra Eshes Ach, right, vis-a-vis Leah, who's the sister of Shimon's wife, Rachel. And Adarab, if you're going to add a second Erva, namely Eshes Ach, when Reuven marries Leah, then although there could be a potential heter for Makom Yibum, we're going to say Adarab. The Isser of Achos Ishto, what word do I want to use? Isser of Achos Ishto now overrides the matir of Eshes Ach. Right? Because you, in whole, you always have a relationship between the matir and the osir. But the question is, which way do you want to go? Do you want to say that the matir now can be extended to the case that's osir? Do you want to say the opposite? The case that's osir should expand and extend to the case that's mutter. I mean, to flip a coin. Neither of the two are more. Neither one of any of those two are more compelling than the other one. So therefore, we need that Reuven married Leah first, and that gives a priority to the matir of Eshes Ach vis-a-vis the erva of Achos Isha. So I think, according to that second case, second explanation, even if it would be Vas Achas, it would be awesome. Yeah, that's what I think. In other words, the second approach says that you can only apply Hol v'Ishrei Ishterei when you have some adifus. Without the adifus, you're in checkmate. You're a taker. You don't really know which way to turn. Should the matir schlep along the Isser and be matir the Isser, or the other way around? Maybe the Isser should schlep along the matir, overwhelming the matir and create an Isser on the matir. So is it that the heter Eshes Ach is going to be extended to Achos Ishto? The Adarab, the Erev of Achos Ishto should be extended to Eshes Ach. And at the end of the day, you're in a stalemate. You have no way of being machriya, unless one came before the other. That's the only measuring rod that we can implement. So if it was a case of Vas Achas, we would not be able to apply the Svar of Hol v'Ishtei Ishto. But if we go back, now we go back to the first Svar. What was the first Svara? That we need to prevent the Isser from being Chal. So if Reuven married first, then when Shimon marries, later there's no Isser. But if Shimon married first, then the Isser was already Chal, and that's too late to apply the principle of Hol. Hol can't matter an Isser, it's already engraved in stone. So now he's saying that if it was Vas Achas, one could sort of blow up the other. The matir could blow up the Isser. Because again, according to the first approach of Elchanan, there isn't built-in adifus to the matir. The matir has within it a matir power. But the only thing is, it has to implement that power before the Isser is Chal. So that if the matir came before the Isser, like Achos Eshes Ochid came before Achos Ishto, that will prevent the erva. Again, only b'makom yibum, but that would prevent the erva of Achos Ishto from being Chal. And because of the inherent power of the heter to prevent Isser being Chal, we could apply Hol v'Ishtei even in the case of Vas Achas. The cost of litlos b'shnei tzad of elis hamachlokes hasugya shebekrisus isa. The Gemara increases on Daf Yudalid, establishes shemikach sheribsa Torah v'shilach biad ish iti shasor lazozel mishtalech af b'shavis. Is mochiach raf from shein erevot sol yom kippurim. Shivlo ken alo pshita shu doches hashavis kishem shu doche es yom kippurim. Loma hutzrecha haTorah l'ravos. So the Gemara establishes that you could send out the sorry even on Shabbos, and from that, Rafram proves that ein erevot sol yom kippurim. Im lokain halo pshita. Just 1 second. So the heter on Shabbos is not based on overriding the Shabbos, because that we would know from the fact that it overrides Yom Kippur. And we have a ribui that even on Shabbos there's shiluach biad iti. So what was this ribui teaching me? The shilach biad ish iti. It's teaching me that on a regular Yom Kippur, which is chal, not on a Shabbos, but on a weekday, there's no problem. There's no erevot sol Yom Kippur. The Gemara rejects it. Hod Rafram bedusa lefisha shiny sora mishtalech b'Yom Kippurim shekol hechsher mitzvaso while yedei iser hotzah while kein nitalo iser Yom Kippurim. If I understand correctly, there's no way of being Mekayim the mitzvah shiluach the ish iti unless you violate the Yisrael Tzah. How else are you going to get it out to the midbar? And therefore the Torah was matir the Yisra Yom Kippurim. It's still possible that the Torah would not be matir the Yisra Shabbos. What do you mean any dochas Shabbos? We're talking about a case where Yom Kippurim overlaps with Shabbos. And how are you going to fulfill the mitzvah of Shiluach unless you violate the Yisrael of Shabbos? But this has nothing to do with what Rafram wants to prove of Ein Erev Hotzah Yom Kippurim. Because it's certainly not Pshita Shudochas HaShabbos. Could be that it's Doch Yom Kippurim because there's no other way of implementing the Shiluach HaSoyer. That's what it means. It means they violate the Yisrael Psah. But it's still possible that it's not Dochas Shabbos. What does that mean? It's not Dochas Shabbos. Aren't we talking about a case of an overlap? Sure. Anyway, he goes on to say, Kosva Tosfos, Shebiyuma, Mevia Gemara es Memras Rafram, the Eno Meres al Torah Shebedusa. The Gemara Yuma just simply is not aware of the rejection of Rafram. It just presents Rafram. Whereas the Gemara in Krisus said Bedusa, that Rafram is not acceptable. Again, we have two sugyas. And one sugya is in Krisus, Taf Yudalit, and there the Gemara comes to the conclusion that we have to reject Rafram. And yet our Gemara in Yuma tells you that it's on Samach Vav Amid Beis. The Gemara accepts the opinion of Rafram. Yeshlomish and Nechleku Asugios b'shnei atztodim amurim b'din hoel v'ishtrei ishtre. Shemei asugi b'yuma asugi b'yuma sofer shemei achar v'isur Shabbos v'isur Yom Kippurim chalav v'vasacha. So at least that we got right. There's an overlap now between Shabbos and Yom Kippur. Hoel v'ishtrei isur Yom Kippurim ishrei af isur Shabbos. Asugi b'krisus overes shafim chalim shnei isur vasachas ein omrim hol v'ishrei ishri ela adraba yesh lomar hol v'nesar shivua Shabbos nesar af mishum Yom Kippur. As we said before, the nafkamina between the two approaches, which really depends upon whether or not the matir is superior to the oser, or it could go either way, is going to be b'vasachas. And here's a case where Shabbos and Yom Kippur are both chal b'vasachas, both isurim. So is it possible to say that since the Torah was matir hotzah vis-a-vis Yom Kippur, therefore ipso facto, whole v'ishrei ishri, it's matir hotzah vis-a-vis Shabbos as well? But the only problem is that both isurim were chal b'vasachas, Shabbos and Yom Kippur. We're not sure if you could apply the principle of whole Vishrei Ishrei in a case of Vasa. Okay, now let's go back to our Gemara. And the Gemara says Ella. That's on line 3. Ella Nasa Chai the Achach Nasa Mes. So it means that Shimon married Rachel before Reuven married Leah. Is Isra Achotz Isha Kodim. So it means that before the Isra Esha Sach was Kal, the Isra Achotz Isha was Chal, because the very second that Reuven marries Leah, she's Asura on Shimon Midine Achos Ishto. He writes here, Afilu im natir Isur Eshes Achama Uchar, Nikomakom Isra Achos Isha Mukto Mimenu Omed Bieno. Lefisha Eina Torah Sa Isra Mauchar Matir Sa Isra Shekodem. Fine, that's what we have. Hikshu atosus ishon. Echef shalahamis oleho. Biofen kazer. Meaning that there's no hole for ishtre ishtre. Sorry. Elo shenosa hames velomes. Yakach nosa chai. Right, and then he died. Lo ichazile klal. I'm sorry. Now we got it again. Hello. But where are the words ki itzrich? How come I don't see those words? Elo ki itzrich oleo. Do you see those words, by the way, in the Gemara? Elo ki itzrich oleo. Oh, here it is. All right. Elo ki itzrich oleo. So everybody have the place we are now. I would say 12 to 13 lines down from the top of the Chesam and Aleph. First word of the line is Lahavi, if that helps you. Eloki itzrich oleo. Heicha de nosa mes umes. The achach nosa chai. What does it mean? That since Ruvain died before Shimon married Rachel, so already at the time of Shimon's death, Leah was muteres midin Ashes ach. And now we're going to apply the principle hol v'ishtrei ishtrei, if not for the pasuk leha. And we're going to say that the isur of achos ishto is going to be, so to speak, left along. It's nigrar, it's nimshach, basar, the heter of Ashes ach. Tosi shonim. Eich efshal lahamed es oleh b'ofen kazeh harei militzor shenemar v'yoso kasu nidrash tur tsaras erva. If lo nas te erva liyachar shemeis baila madua tsaras ptura harei miolam lo haisu tsaras erva. Now, right? The status of Leah as an erva to Shimon was established when Shimon married Rachel. And now we're looking for Saras Erva. What would Erva be in this case? So it means that Reuven is married not only to Leah, but he's also married to, we'll call her Rivka. And Rivka is now a Tsaras Ereva. Why? Because Leah is the sister of Shimon's wife, Rachel, and therefore Rivka is a Tsaras Ereva. So far, so good. So the Tosi Shanim asks, what do you mean? Why should Rivka be excluded from Yibum when the only the status of Erva with regard to Leah only emerged after the death of Reuven, when Shimon subsequently married Rachel. So how can you consider Rivka as a tzara to an erva? The erva, the status of an erva, only emerged after the death of Reuven, so that his wife Rivka was never the tzara of an erva. Wow, that's a brilliant question. You have it? In other words, this pasuk is talking about Litzra, right? The Oleh, Litzra Oleh. And Oleh is going to teach us Achos Ishta. But Litzra is going to teach me the Isur Tzaras Ereva. Now, they can't be, in this scenario, they cannot be a Tzaras Ereva. Because by the time the status of Leah as an Ereva emerged, Reuven was already gone. So his other wife, Rivka, was never in the whole history of Tzaras Ereva. The Tirates. Leah mitaber b'nosa meis umeis v'akach nosa chai. Achal litzor mitaber b'mokum shenosa chai es achot hayivama b'chaye achiv. What does that mean? Somehow he's differentiating between Oleh and Litzra. See, how does that work? Again, Oleh is a case of Nasa Mesu Mesvakach Nasa Chaim. But Litzra is a case of what? B'mokom shenosa chaim es achos hayivama b'chai echa. Oh, in other words, Shimon married Rachel while Reuven was still alive. Right. Since at that moment Reuven is still alive, therefore Rivka, his other wife, becomes a Tzaras Ereva. This is one of those cases where the cash is so much sharper than the teretz. The teretz is really technical. He's just saying that we're addressing two different scenarios. The Litzar is for Tzaras Ereva is addressing one scenario, and the Oleh of Achos Isha is addressing a whole different scenario. All right, I think we'll stop here. Okay, so if you don't mind, Steve, since we got up to here, maybe you wouldn't mind copying Samach Gimel, Samach Daled,